behalf of the Privy Council, I'd like to welcome our officials to this briefing of our panel of ministers. As you know, the head minister for this briefing is the Minister of Immigration, who will introduce his colleagues. Then you can begin.
Thank you very much. My esteemed colleague from Global Affairs, from Finance, from ISED, from Intergovernmental Affairs, and a special guest who is the Chief Executive of the National Association of Settlement Agencies. We're quite encouraged to hear from you this morning. Please.
Okay. Good afternoon, Prime Minister and Ministers. Thank you for joining us this afternoon in response to the UNHCR's Yemeni refugee request. My name is Brooke Boyd, and joining me today are my colleagues, Mr. Leith Wrightman, Ms. Juanita Molano, and Mr. Gabe Senecal. As you know, we are here today because the UNHCR has identified 75,000 Yemeni refugees and has called upon Canada to take in some of these refugees. The question before us is how Canada should respond to this request. More specifically, Canada must decide how many Yemeni refugees to take, in what time frame, and how they should be resettled. Our key objective here is to target a number of Yemeni refugees for resettlement in a way that is both balanced and achievable based on current levels of ambition, while also considering the lessons learned from the Syrian refugee crisis. I will now invite my colleague, Mr. Leith Wrightman, to speak to key considerations.
Thank you, Brooke. Good afternoon. The current government has made a commitment to follow the rule of international law and human rights. In considering our level of ambition and commitment, we have key considerations that we must go through. These are the 6 key considerations, which I will elaborate on in the next slide. So in evaluating our ambition, we got to look at the Syrian crisis. The Syrian crisis has many parallels to the Yemeni crisis in terms of capacity. At the federal capacity level, we saw in the Syrian crisis that, yes, we can process the number of security clearances, health checks, and bring them over here. And that was what readily attained in the Syrian, and in the Yemen crisis, we know we can accomplish this. Of course, public approval in the Syrian crisis was really galvanized when the picture of Alan Kurdi came out, and it really brought a lot of groundswell of support. And we saw many private sponsors of refugees that came out and helped settle refugees. In the Yemeni crisis, it's been 4 years since this humanitarian crisis has started to occur, and we haven't seen that policy window open up where the Canadian public is galvanized around a picture like Alan Kurdi. Of course, in regional economic needs, this is what we learned from resettling those 25,000 Syrians, is that we were able to bring them into such communities as Chatham and Peterborough, and we're able to really help those municipalities out with their regional needs, and it was very successful in many regards. But we can learn from this and improve on this if we choose to bring in more refugees from Yemen. Of course, at a local capacity level, in our consultation with nonprofit groups such as 613 Refugee and Acosti in Toronto, we know that at the local capacity, our key partners were overburdened. Bringing in 25,000 refugees over such a short period of time is a big burden on our key partners. At that time, there wasn't as much planning. It was done in a very short period of time. Now we have learned from those. We can bring over refugees and settle them in a timely manner, and our partners are equipped on the ground. Of course, our international and human rights objectives were met in the Syrian crisis. We stepped up on the world stage and received considerable praise from the UN and from other countries for our commitment to human rights. Right now, the government's stance on the Yemeni crisis, which we're dealing with today, is ambiguous. It depends on how much ambition and commitment to human rights we have. And of course, the question about provincial support at the time when we were resettling Syrian refugees, there was a lot of support from the provinces. But changes in provincial leadership has brought changes in provincial priorities, and there is some resistance. Although not all provinces are resistant to settling in refugees, there are some.
Some big ones.
Yes, some big ones.
Indeed.
So speaking more of our operational capacity, over In late 2018, the Canadian government set out some ambitious immigration targets ranging from 300,000 to 350,000 total immigration across the board. Of this, a subset is their humanitarian intake targets. In 2019, it's set for 50,000. In 2020, it's 54,000. And in 2021, it's 57,000. This is an average of a range. And these are what the IRCC has budgeted for. If we choose to address the Yemeni crisis, then we can bring in a number of refugees over our 3-year plan. Inside those, if we choose to, our ambition is higher, then we can go over those, but that would incur extra costs. And of course, it's not about numbers, it's not about processing it. Resettling refugees is a very human issue. It's not about our efficiency, it's about our success on the ground. And that is where our key partners come in. With our consultations with on-the-ground partners, such as our resettlement assistance programs, we learned that they are prepared, they're ready, their networks and capacity is much larger than it was before. And also local immigration partnerships as well. Ontario made networking between programs that really brings it increases the efficiency and the needs in assigning, bringing the refugees to the programs that they're in need of. And of course, it's important to look at the regional lens. In the Syrian crisis, 20% of the Syrians were resettled in Toronto. Now, the costs in Toronto are much higher than it is elsewhere in the country. A single-bedroom apartment in Toronto is $2,000 a month. Imagine trying to get a Syrian family of 5 into affordable housing. It is a real challenge in our major metropolitan areas. Now, this is why a regional lens and bringing them to cheaper communities where the rent is not so high really lessens the burden. I will now invite my colleague, Gabe Senecal, to talk about policy options and implementation.
Thank you. Policy options. So where does all this background leave us? Essentially, Canada at first has to make a decision. Will Canada bring in all of the Yemeni refugees needing resettlement, some of them, or none of them at all? There are advantages and disadvantages, of course, between these three options, but fundamentally it is not acceptable to Canada if Canada wishes to uphold its commitment to human rights, to international human rights, to take in none. And similarly, it is not possible for our provincial and non-profit partners to withstand the constraints of resources that taking in all of these Yemeni refugees will put on them. So we are left with some refugees. Within that, we have a subset of 3 tiers of levels of refugee intake that are options that we present to you today. The first option, high, is 20 to 25,000 refugees per year. The second, medium, is 10 to 15,000 refugees per year. And the third, of course, is low, with 4 to 8,000 refugees per year. All 3 of these levels have 3 core implementation points, which we will speak to later, but those 3 implementation points are universally transferable between these 3 tiers. So it is important to consider these trade-offs between the different levels, but ultimately the implementation of whatever decision the Cabinet makes, whatever decision the Cabinet chooses, is transferable in our plan here. So I'd like to acknowledge that while we have various criteria that we can compare our recommended option, option B, with options A and option C, essentially we need to consider Canada's ambition and Canada's resource constraints. Essentially, our capacity and the alignment it has with the specific ambition Canada chooses to make will form the exact option that we have presented to you today. That's 10 to 15,000 refugees per year. So in comparing the exact criteria and differentiating between A, B, and C, we can see that the option A, the first option, the high option, it does not respect the burden the provincial and nonprofit counterparts must sustain if they're going to actually be able to address incoming refugees to this capacity. And similarly, option C, it has its own disadvantages. So while public opposition for all 3 is a little bit ambiguous, it's difficult to ascertain how those plans will generate public response, it is pretty certain to say that a larger intake of refugees will have spillover effects from these lack of capacities at the provincial and nonprofit level and will result in more public opposition. So therefore, of course, we recommend the second option. And I should say that all of these options are based on evidence and from lessons we have observed and through our analysis of the Syrian refugee resettlement process. So I'll speak to implementation now. How do we implement this plan now that we've identified the exact number that we recommend as a group here to you today? As I alluded to earlier, there are 3 pillars of this implementation plan. Those pillars are community clusters, regional resettlement, and of course, international leadership. So regarding the first, community clusters, it's important to consider the evidence in analyzing this. And we found as a group that when Canada grouped Syrian refugees together in small communities, whether it be in northern British Columbia, northern British Columbia was not a Syrian refugee resettlement. It was a Bhutanese refugee resettlement effort. But when refugees are grouped together, whether it be in rural British Columbia or rural Manitoba or in the mid-sized Ontario cities, there are enhancements in the level of community integration that those refugees find. Something about a small town often does lend itself to building community, making friendships, and creating an attachment to a place, a sense of place that isn't necessarily rivaled by more expensive city counterparts. So essentially, we are proposing, clustering refugee families in these areas to ensure that they have this community cohesion and this social integration to the extent that we hope, and to essentially maximize their chance of success in forming an attachment to an area and reducing secondary migration to the dense cities which are facing resource constraints. We also need to ensure that each of these community clusters has access to the right types of language training and skills training to set them up for success as well. And finally, we need to acknowledge that family reunification is a key part of this clustering effort. No family is going to be satisfied unless everyone they deem vital to their immediate family, their notion of immediate family, of course, may not be the same as many Canadians' notion of immediate family. Those family reunification efforts are key to ensure that secondary migration is avoided wherever possible. And in that, we have asked RRCC to continue looking at efforts to better implement family reunification processes in regards to clustering as well as overall. Moving on to the second pillar, regional resettlement. As I alluded to earlier, and my colleague Mr. Wrightman alluded to earlier, there are advantages in placing these communities, these clusters, in different areas outside of our major cities. While Vancouver's and Toronto's have services, those services are burdened, and there are plenty of opportunities to actually meet regional economic and population development goals across the country, such as in the Atlantic immigration pilot. We also are trying to be responsive in this plan to provincial concerns in that the resource constraints each province has and each region has. And finally, it's of course important to very much underline and underscore the benefit that the refugee families themselves have from not facing the enormous burden of high housing costs in the largest metropolitan areas of this country. So essentially, that leaves us with our third pillar of implementation, that is international leadership. So this plan asks Canada to reaffirm its international commitment to human rights. Canada needs to pressure its allies. Canada needs to work with its allies to ensure that those allies are contributing in whatever way is possible to this crisis. Now, many of our allies, such as the United States and others, are rather reticent to take in refugees, and that is their decision, of course. However, Canada can ask and can push evidence forward to suggest a farther implementation of aid from those countries more proportional to what it has already had. Of course, Canada has sent in $130 million of refugee aid to Yemen since 2015, and we recommend that Canada continues looking at various humanitarian aid options to essentially align with the resettlement effort and ensure that these Yemeni refugees are best cared for as possible. With that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Ms. Molano, to continue.
Thank you, Mr. Senecal. So, for the implementation of our recommendation, we have established immediate, medium, and long-term actions. To begin with, and based on our recommendation of a community cluster-based approach, we recommend that the Government of Canada identifies the communities that would be welcoming the targeted number of refugees to be resettled into Canada. This would in turn signal to IRCC, as well as our local immigration partnerships, the level of funding through our resettlement assistance programs that would be channeled in this direction. In addition, our recommendation includes that the government seizes an opportunity for innovation. That is, for IRCC to partner with Canadian Digital Services to set out a number of pilots to test out not the idea of taking in more Yemeni refugees, but rather to test administrative processes with which we can more effectively resettle our refugees. In the medium and long term, it is our recommendation to continuously monitor for success, but also to ensure that we are meeting our capacity accordingly. Throughout the Syrian refugee crisis in our resettlement and in consultation with our on-ground forces, we realized that they were encountering or dealing with a number of problems that spoke to contribution agreements. At this time around, we have planned for instituting a system that will streamline contribution agreements and ensure that funding is released accordingly. In the long term, following the end of commitment of direct financial commitment to the assistance of refugees, we recommend continuously monitoring for factors of social and economic success that contribute to regional development. And by that time, and speaking a year into or 3 years after, we would take recommendations from the partnership that we are recommending in order to start instituting models for effective resettlement. And then we would evaluate a budget to institute these accordingly. Instrumental to the implementation is the availability of funds. We have come up with a figure that meets the ambition that we are striving for and that needs to be matched with commitment. 100 million per annum includes the funding that other federal agencies and departments would need, that our provincial partners would be asking for, that our on-ground forces through resettlement assistance programs, as well as local immigration partnerships would be asked for, and finally, the innovation that we are looking to get out of, that we, as a government, could seize the opportunity to get. The assumptions that we would look at then, that we looked at for this number, considered the current IRCC budget that includes the targeted quotas for refugee intake, as well as the costs that were incurred throughout the Syrian refugee crisis and the resettlement of 25,000 refugees over a span of 3 months, the possibility of additional efforts from our private partners via private sponsorship programs, as well as the blended visa programs, which is considering that it is additional to the efforts of the government. And finally, the possibility of intergovernmental support. We saw throughout the Syrian refugee crisis that the provinces were willing to step up to the plate and make sure that the social and health needs of the refugees were also met. As I alluded to earlier, we recommend a partnership between Canada Digital Services and the Innovation Unit of IRCC. This would be to set up a number of pilots that test the most efficient way to resettle refugees. I would like to turn your attention to the use of user-centric design. User-centric design considers the needs of those that would be receiving the service, not just the refugees, but also our nonprofit organizations that would be delivering these services. This is to deliver the services from their perspective, really considering what they would need. For example, one of the aspects that have been evaluated is the language used in these services. How are the refugees that are settling in Canada interpreting the services? It's important for them to understand that we do have what they need and we can offer it. And with this, I invite my colleague, Brooke Boyd.
Thank you. In response to our risk assessment and management, as my colleagues alluded to earlier, we need to consider public reception. We realize that there is an ambiguity there, but we have decided that based on a target of 10 to 15,000 Yemeni refugees, this is a number that meets the current levels of ambition and commitment. I would like to draw your attention to risk number 2, the uncollaborative response from stakeholders, which is a large potential, especially with the provinces. As my colleague Juanita mentioned earlier, we have decided to mitigate this using our financing and operational tools. We want to provide funding directly to the province, but also directly to our stakeholders through RAPs and LIPs, which help alleviate the provincial burdens in facilitating settlement operations on the ground. Third of all, misunderstanding needs of refugees and stakeholders is something that we have to take into account, but as alluded to earlier with our innovation strategy, we feel that this is a way that we can alleviate that risk. I would also like to draw your attention to number 4, the potential for future humanitarian crises. We see this mitigated through an opportunity to build and maintain our capacity in order to better prepare ourselves to respond to future humanitarian crises. Our communications plan is comprised of 3 key messages. The first is that this is the right thing to do. The second is that Canada is a world leader in refugee resettlement. And third, that Canada welcomes refugees. These 3 key messages will be our foundation to engage with our intergovernmental partners, our non-for-profits, and also our international organizations and allies. We realize that this challenge requires a pan-Canadian response and commitment. We feel that we have taken a very pragmatic approach here today, especially in consideration to what we have learned with the Syrian refugee crisis. Additionally, we feel that the target that we are reaching for in terms of resettling refugees is something that is achievable based on the current levels of ambition and commitment. Finally, we would like to reiterate that this challenge is a great opportunity for our government to build its capacity, enhance, and learn from our previous experiences and be better prepared to anticipate future humanitarian crises to respond more effectively. In conclusion, we feel that with this policy option that we've presented today, that Canada will be able to effectively resettle Yemeni refugees and integrate them into communities while contributing to regional economic development. Thank you, and we now invite you to questions.
I'll start off with a question, if I may. So thank you for that presentation. That was very interesting. My question is about regional resettlement. How do you propose to achieve or to fix your targets for where and how many you're going to resettle in small and medium-sized municipalities? Like, is this something you're going to do after consulting the provinces? Are you going to get their agreement on this, or are you going to just go ahead and do it, or what's your proposal on that?
Yes, I'd like to speak to that. Thank you for the question. In this regard, part of this is focusing on the experience of the key partners on the ground. When we brought over Syrian refugees, there were communities that were phoning Toronto and saying, hey, we have the capacity to take them into our communities. You know, some of them were even saying, hey, my friend has a job. He wants to give a Syrian refugee. And that was something that we experienced here in Toronto with the LIPS that we mentioned earlier, the organizing, the networking organizations of programs. And so this is one of the key things we are looking at in addressing that issue. And it also to speak of secondary migration, once they come over, our goal is to keep them ideally keep them in the same spot, but that is, based on our constitution, they are able to move around, freedom of movement, so we can't hold them. We can only, put carrots there and make sure that they are well settled in communities that support their needs.
Ministers, can I just jump in with, I'm intrigued by a couple of things. I'm intrigued because this looks like a bargain, first of all, I got to say that. But the second thing that intrigues me is the digital aspect. And if this is to be a digital government approach to the issue, then it's probably going to be iterative, which to me means that we got to get data and evidence out in real time. And I can see the data and evidence on the cost side, but I don't see the data and evidence on the economic benefit side. So could you say a few words about how we're going to bring sort of positive evidence to bear in real time?
In real time, absolutely. This speaks to the portion of our recommendation that refers to a regional development. In real time, over government has a year that it commits to resettlement, to financially directly assist in the resettlement of refugees. And throughout this time, we, as a government, we participate through our RAPs and our LIPs, and they will be delivering the information to us. Throughout our timeline, which I presented earlier, in the medium and long term, this would be regular monitoring. The year would be over month periods, and later on, it would be through longer periods.
Thank you.
I agree with my colleague on the potential bargain here of up to 15,000 refugees for $100 million, if I understand this correctly. But I am also worried about the expectations that are being created because of the potential open-ended nature of the communication. So we say 100 million per annum. We say 15,000 refugees per annum. What's our communications plan going to say about the end game? Are we just going to say 15,000 and $100 million, full stop, or are we going to create the expectation for multiple years of this in our budget?
Thank you. Our plan is for
5 minutes, ministers.
Thank you. Our plan is for 3 years of refugee resettlement at the recommended level of 10 to 15,000 per year. And what was the first portion of your question? Sorry.
So potentially 45,000 total.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of Yemeni.
Of Yemeni refugees
Yeah.
specifically, and of course.
And $300 million.
Yes, that's correct. And that is not inclusive of the existing funds within our current budget that are
On top of.
Yes, 100 new million of funding. Thank you.
I do want to commend you on recognizing the vital role that settlement agencies and NGOs play. I also would have to say, from my perspective, that I think the looking at the grants and contributions to the organizations directly and streamlining that process, because that is a definite learning from the Syrian experience. But I'm curious, what percentage of that 100,000 are you thinking are going to go directly to the not the NGO sector?
Yeah. That percentage would be considered under the resettlement assistance programs as well as our local immigration partnerships. Our local immigration partnerships, as my colleague spoke to earlier, they're a network that coordinate the funds. And if you're talking about percentage, they are a significant portion of it. Throughout the Syrian refugee crisis, the phase 5, which was the settlement portion, was very low percentage in that. This time around, this is why we're asking for additional 100 million per year to alleviate this portion. So it would be more of a significant percentage. We're thinking more towards the 30%.
And I've also noted that you raised the housing issue. Have you thought about some of the other programs like the National Housing Strategy as being a component of this?
Absolutely. It speaks to a much larger problem that Canada is experiencing. It also speaks to other concerns that that provinces are particularly concerned about. But the government is dealing with this through different approaches. The National Housing Strategy is, of course, something we considered, which is why our additional budget that we are asking is limited to 100 million.
So recognition of that program.
So in terms of, you've positioned nicely, in my opinion, the access to language training, registration of children in schools. It's obvious, but it's not always obvious that if your child's in school, you're less likely to want to leave a community, and if you're making friends with the other parents, et cetera, et cetera. So I appreciate that, and I also appreciate the look at the whole family, the female male dynamics, et cetera, child care and sense of belonging, et cetera. How would you suggest that we counter, the challenge we may get from provinces that we're kind of telling them how to do their business, and we should be paying for it, but not telling them how to do their business?
Thank you for the question. Intergovernmental relations are nebulous and complex and difficult to navigate, to say the least. You all know much better than we do, of course.
Good summary.
it's not easy to encourage provinces to act in any particular way. We are trying to work around the provincial governments wherever we may to encourage this refugee resettlement regionally within each province and regionally across Canada with these nonprofit partners. However, of course, that will require liaison with each of the provinces in each particular regard of the different clusters that are relevant to each provincial region. Does that answer your question sufficiently,
Or
Minister?
making them a proxy to the provincial government, I'm assuming. Making the organizations a proxy, so that it's not a Fed prov.
Yes, Anne, but without negating the value of our provincial
Of
partnerships.
course not, of course not.
You talked, I thought appropriately, about the requirement for longer-term evaluation and monitoring and so forth, but you were a little light on the specifics associated with that, sort of actual performance measures and so forth.
Unfortunately, Minister, I have to stop you there. We have another briefing awaiting you. So I want to thank our officials for sharing their advice and for joining us with this panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.